let me start a little bit with just your question about bias. I think it's a very important one because everybody's heard about bias in these algorithms and bias we have in algorithms. And we did introduce the idea of bias in algorithms when we moved from explaining things to the system to large patterns of data. So whatever those large patterns of data contained in them, we reproduce in these algorithms that look for probabilities. But the thing becomes really interesting in this generative AI conversation when we talk about bias and is the data biased? Of course, the data we feed it is biased, like the internet, right? Well, if you think about what pictures we have on the internet. But the models themselves do not, as in other models, do not store the pictures that we feed them, do not store the text that we feed them. So what it gets encoded is a generalness of a thing, right? Banananess or catness or apeness. So they're not biased. They give you the statistical average of the thing. So for instance, with image models, you cannot get them to draw you a single banana because all pictures of bananas are usually a bunch of bananas. So you say, draw a banana, it will give you 2 bananas, right? There's people on the internet trying to make the banana thing. You can eventually get it, but it still kind of looks weird and you can tell there's one behind. But this sort of thing, so if you ask it to draw your doctor, it will be most of the time a male doctor. We randomize the initial prompt a little bit, so you sometimes get a woman doctor, but this idea of bias works very differently in generative AI than our common understanding of bias, which then goes to your regulation question. We're in an interesting moment in history when we have to rethink the categories we use to understand these technologies. Bias is one of them. What does bias mean for generative AI? It's something different. Same with this idea of copyright. So again, we're talking about regulation. If you think that they ingest these vast amounts of data, right? Some of it copyrighted data, but they don't store the data. So technically that becomes kind of a gray area because they're not copying anything. They're storing likenesses of that data. So we need to probably invent new categories to regulate these systems, new ways of thinking about it. Maybe it's rights of reference, right? Instead of copyright, and we pay the people whose content was used to train these algorithms, or you have opt-outs or various other things. So I think some of these will need us rethinking the categories that we use to regulate. As to where they're used, that's a very difficult question to answer because I think regulation will always fall behind the technology. So we're in a university here. My advice to everyone is we can't just wait for the regulation to solve these problems for us. What we need is healthy public debate, part of why you're here, and education. These things are new and they work differently to how we think they work, right? For all these things, their string of numbers doesn't understand the idea of we're feral or a cat or anything really. They're just probabilities of things going with other things. So educate yourselves. University of Sydney has, micro-credentials on AI fluency and all that, steak knives, right? I'm wearing the brand colors here, but try to learn as much as you can about the systems.
If I can add to that, because that's an interesting point. In Japan, they're not discussing the regulation of AI. They trust that their population are going to be in a dialogue and learning, so people would understand the limitations and what they are doing. They have this overview idea when they discuss it in the public forum. They go to the OECD or the UN, they say, no, we trust our people and our companies to do the right thing and people to understand it. That's very different from other countries, obviously.
That worked out well with social media. But
and on the point of liability, which was mentioned before, and the need of new rules, well, it depends. Typical example, a self-driving car, automated cars. Well, we know currently everybody's driving a car. We have a system of compulsory insurance. If something happens, that works relatively well because the people are going to be insured, you know that. So for self-driving cars that may have even less accidents than human drivers, we may already have the solution there. We might not need anything else. The problem with AI systems for me is the scalability. So you get all the Teslas in the world, and there is some kind of failure in the AI system that keeps learning from the environment. You have all of them in self-driving system, and all of a sudden, all the systems fail at the same time. And that is not an individual problem that you can solve with insurance. It becomes a social problem. The typical example that I tend to use is the thermostats. Imagine that we are all in the middle of a cold, very cold winter or a very, very hot summer. We are all using the same technology. Google Nest, for example, is the typical one. I'm doing a lot of product placement. Don't worry, it's not. And
University of Sydney.
yeah. And all of a sudden, all of them fail at the same time because there was a push of artificial intelligence. The system autonomously decided to do a push that was tested well in the laboratory, but then in the real world, it's failing. Well, if it's the middle of winter, and did happen in 2017 in the US, by the way, it's not a made-up example, the good thing about it is not that many people had the technology. But it becomes a problem at the scale because one person can change the batteries. Two people can call like Google and be sent like a new system. If it's all of a sudden you have millions of people using and they do not have a heating system at home, then the problem is at such a scale that it becomes a social problem. And those are the things where new technologies, because we don't understand them well, we need to know how they do, and we need to preempt at least those very extreme risks.